Hi, welcome to Optics and Eye Health channel. Today, we want to look at anatomy of the eye. This is part 2, and this time round, we want to look at the structures of the eye in details in terms of their functions and importance to the eye. Here is the famous structure of the eye as an organ. And before we begin, it's important to understand that the language of anatomy uses the terms like anterior and posterior. So this area, in front of the eye, is what we refer to as the anterior aspect of the eye. This area at the back of the eye, that is what we refer to as the posterior aspect of the eye. So we shall try to review these structures from anterior aspect towards the posterior aspect. Starting from this point, what you are seeing here is the structure we refer to as the cornea. This structure here, on top of it, around here, is the tear film, and the tear film, its function is to lubricate the surface of the eye. Apart from lubrication, the tear film also protects this structure here, the cornea. It also serves a function of nourishment to the cornea. Remember, the cornea is avascular, and therefore it obtains its oxygen direct from air, and that's the function of the tear film, among others. From the cornea, we now come into the inside of the eye, and the entire space inside the eye is divided into two segments. We have what we recall as the anterior segment and what we call as the posterior segment. The anterior segment of the eye begins from the posterior aspect of the cornea to the anterior aspect of the lens. The posterior segment of the eye begins on the posterior aspect of the lens and spans all the way to the retina. The anterior segment is further divided into two. what we call the anterior chamber and the posterior chamber. The anterior chamber is the space that you can see here that begins from the posterior aspect of the cornea to the anterior aspect of the iris. The posterior chamber is the space that you can see here between the posterior aspect of the iris to the anterior aspect of the lens. These two chambers, the anterior and the posterior, contain a transparent fluid known as the aqueous humor. The aqueous humor is produced at this point here. This is the ciliary body. It contains ciliary processes whose function is to produce aqueous humor. Then we come to this point here. What you are seeing here is an aperture, which is an opening to the eye, and that's what we refer to as the pupil. It is not a structure, it's just an opening to the eye, whose function is to regulate the amount of light entering the eye. So the pupil changes in size to regulate the amount of light entering the eye. In dim light, the pupil increases in its size so as to allow more light to enter the eye. But in bright light, the pupil reduces in size to regulate the amount of light that enters the eye. From the pupil, we have the iris, these red structures you see in between here. The function of the iris, it contains muscles whose function is to regulate the size of the pupil, and these muscles include the sphincter pupillae and the dilator pupillae. The sphincter pupillae muscles constrict to reduce the amount of light entering the eye, while the dilator pupillae muscles, they function to dilate the pupil and allow more light to enter the eye. From there we come to the lens. The structure you see in whitish color here is the lens. The function of the lens is to focus light to the retina, and what you need to remember is that this lens, they change in size in the process we refer to as accommodation, so as to focus light to the retina to bring an image into sharp focus. Remember to note that the posterior aspect of the lens is more convex compared to the anterior aspect of the lens. What you are seeing here is the ciliary body, and what you are seeing here is the suspensory ligaments. They coordinate the function of changing the shape of the lens to regulate, or rather to bring or focus light to the retina. In the process we refer to as accommodation. So what you need to remember is that this lens changes the shape. For example, when the object is very close to the eye, this lens will become more convex so as to bring light focused on this area referred to the macula and bring the image into sharp focus. We come to this bigger space you see here. This space is what we refer to as the vitreous body. It's just a jelly-like substance which is also transparent and also has refraction power and also aids in allowing light to pass through so as to reach the retina, among other functions. We come to these structures you see around here. What you see in blue is the veins. The retinal veins, they function to drain the eye into the ophthalmic vein. The ophthalmic vein, which again empties into the cavernous sinus. And what you see here, the red structure, is the retinal arteries. The retinal arteries is a branch of ophthalmic artery. The ophthalmic artery itself is a branch of the internal carotid artery. Function of the retinal artery is to supply blood to the eye structures. We come to this point you see here. This point is called the macula. It has high concentration of photoreceptors, particularly the cones, that function to transduce light signals into electrical signals that are picked by the optic nerve and transmitted to the brain. Actually, the primary visual cortex, what we refer to as Brodmann Classification Area 17 for interpretation of the signals and visualization. So you need to know we have high concentration of photopigments and photoreceptors in this point here. What you see in the yellow color is the retina, also known as the neural layer of the eye. It's the layer that contains photoreceptors. Function of photoreceptors is to transduce light signals into electrical signals that are then picked by the optic nerve and transmitted to the brain for visualization. The red structure you see here is the choroid, and the choroid contains blood vessels that also contribute in supplying blood to the eye. In that process, it also functions to regulate the amount of temperature on this layer we call the retina, among other functions. The white layer you see here is the sclera. It's actually the outermost layer of the eye. You can see it extends to this point here. It actually gives the shape of the eyeball, and also has protective functions among other functions of the eye. Here is the optic nerve, and the function of the optic nerve is just to pick electrical signals from the retina and transmit it to the brain for interpretation and visualization. We shall also, at some point in the subsequent presentations, look at the anatomical structure and course of the optic nerve from the eye to the brain. One thing you need to remember is that from the tear film on the surface of the cornea itself, the aqueous humor in both anterior and posterior chambers, the pupil, the lens here, and the vitreous body form what we refer to as the optic system of the eye. So these structures I've mentioned here form the optical system of the eye. They have one common characteristic, and that is transparency. All these structures from this point to this point are transparent. The reason being, they must allow light to pass through up to this point for you to be able to see. Therefore, any obstruction on these structures we have mentioned will cause opacification. Therefore, it means light will not be able to pass through, and therefore you will not be able to see. One of the commonest opacification pathology on the lens is what we refer to as the cataracts. It's a common condition in the elderly patients, whereby this structure you see here undergoes opacification, limiting the passage of light to the retina, and therefore causing blindness. But this condition is reversible. This structure is normally removed. The procedure we refer to as cataract surgery, whereby the opacified lens is removed and an artificial lens is inserted and vision is restored. That marks the end of Anatomy of the Eye Part 2, where we have looked at various structures of the eye and their functions. Remember to subscribe to our channel for more and more presentations and knowledge in the medical field. Thank you.